The fluorescent lights in the emergency room buzzed with a persistent hum that matched the throbbing in her temples. Each breath Elena took sent a sharp pain through her rib cage, a reminder of the places where his fists had connected with bone. She pressed the ice pack against her swollen cheek, wincing at the contact, and watched the familiar chaos of the ER unfold around her. 3 months. That was how long she had been working as a nurse at St. Catherine's Hospital, trying to rebuild a life she thought had been destroyed. The night shifts were brutal, the pay barely enough to cover rent on her rundown studio apartment and send money to the nursing home for Sophia, the 16-year-old sister in a wheelchair waiting for her there. But it was honest work, clean work, far removed from the darkness of her past. She should have been on the other side of the triage desk wearing scrubs and helping patients. Instead, she sat in a plastic chair with a paper gown covering her torn shirt, waiting for her turn to be examined. The irony was not lost on her. She had spent 9 years running from violence only to have it follow her here, into the one place she thought she was safe. Her stepfather had found her. Elena knew it was only a matter of time, but part of her had hoped he would forget about her, move on to his next victim. That hope died tonight when she came home to find Ray Donovan waiting outside her apartment building, drunk and angry, demanding money she did not have to pay off debts to men that even the devil feared. The fight had been brief but brutal. He had always been stronger than her, meaner. When she refused to let him into her apartment, he grabbed her by the hair and slammed her head against the brick wall. She had kneed him in the groin, just hard enough to break free, and ran. The hospital was only 4 blocks away, and she had made it to the entrance before collapsing against the automatic doors, gasping for breath. Now, sitting in the harsh fluorescent light, Elena felt the familiar weight of shame settling over her like a blanket. The other nurses pretended not to recognize her, but she saw the whispers, the sympathetic glances. Elena Vasquez, the new girl with the rough background. Elena Vasquez, who could not even protect herself. A nurse she did not recognize called her name, clipboard in hand. She stood, clutching the ice pack, and followed her through the maze of curtained examination areas. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and desperation, a combination she had grown accustomed to during her training but never quite learned to tolerate. She left Elena in exam room 7 with instructions that a doctor would be with her shortly. Elena sat on the paper-covered table, the crinkling sound loud in the small space. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, but she ignored it. Probably her stepfather calling to apologize or threaten, or some toxic combination of both. She had learned years ago that nothing good came from answering his calls. The door opened and she looked up, expecting a doctor. Instead, she saw him, Dante Moretti, the man her mother had died, saving 12 years ago. The story is slowly unraveling its darkest secrets, and Elena is on the verge of facing the man for whom her mother sacrificed her own life. And if you find yourself wondering what will come next, take a quiet moment to press the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell, so you will not miss any of the heartfelt stories shared each day, because a single like and share from you can help this tale reach even more hearts, and I find myself genuinely curious about where you are listening from at this very moment. So please leave a comment with the name of your city or your country below to let me know how far our story has traveled across the world. And now let us continue and see what Dante Moretti will say when he looks at Elena in this condition. He stood there, filling the doorway with a presence that had nothing to do with physical size. Tall with broad shoulders and neatly cropped black hair streaked with silver at the temples, and the cold steel gray of his eyes seemed to see through everything and understand even more. While the expensive suit tailored perfectly to his frame cost more than what she earned in 6 months, and blood stained the white shirt beneath the jacket, his knuckles scraped raw and bright, yet it was his face that held her attention. The sharp and angular lines shaped by a violence long restrained but never truly tamed, and a faint scar ran from his temple down his left cheek, the mark of the bullet her mother had taken for him, and for a moment the two of them simply looked at each other, while the harsh fluorescent lights carved shadows across his features, making him appear both younger and older than she remembered, and recognition flickered in his darkening eyes, followed by something she could not name, perhaps surprise or disbelief, and then the memories crashed into her like a tidal wave. She was 15, standing on the blood-soaked sidewalk outside her family's crumbling apartment, gunfire and screams filling the air, as her mother, Isabella Vasquez, had burst through the door after seeing a stranger about to be shot, acting on instinct with no hesitation, because she had always believed in protecting others, and the bullet had torn through her chest, and Elena remembered running to her, her knees scraping the concrete, while her trembling hands clung to her mother's cooling fingers as the stranger held Isabella in his arms, his clothes soaked with her blood, and with her final breath she had whispered something into his ear, promises and pleas, words Elena could not fully hear except for her own name, and she had heard his voice low and shaking as he swore to keep that promise. And that man was Dante Moretti, the patriarch of the Moretti family and the most powerful mafia organization on the eastern shore of America, though she only learned that later when newspapers and news reports revealed the identity of the man her mother died to save, a monster or a killer or a king of the underworld depending on who was speaking. And Elena had spent 12 years trying to forget that face and the guilty gray eyes that had watched her mother slip away. And now he stood here in examination room 7 of Street, Catherine's hospital, looking at her with those same eyes, and her name on his lips came out as nothing more than a whisper but carried the weight of all the years she had tried to bury, the daughter of Isabella, and she could not speak because her throat tightened, and her heart pounded painfully against her bruised ribs in a way that had nothing to do with physical injury. And as he stepped into the room, she noticed the slight hitch in his gait, and the way he leaned subtly to the right, which told her he was hurt, and that the blood on his shirt was not ornamental, and for one absurd moment, she wondered whether she should offer to help him, then remembered who he was and what he was and kept her mouth shut, addressing him formally as Mr. Moretti while forcing the words past her dry throat and telling him she believed he had the wrong room and that she was waiting for the doctor. Yet he came closer, and her instincts forced her back against the wall, not exactly out of fear but because of something more complicated that made her skin feel too tight and her breath uneven, and his gray eyes swept over her face with a chilling precision, pausing at her swollen cheek, the cut on her forehead, the bruises blooming along her neck, and a muscle twitched in his jaw, the only sign of emotion beneath the iron control of his expression, before he asked in a voice low and dangerous like a predator rumbling in the dark who had done this to her. And when Elena lifted her chin, insisting it was none of his business, and that she would be fine, and that he should take care of whatever had brought him here tonight, she glanced pointedly at the blood on his shirt, hoping he would take the hint and leave. But Dante Moretti did not move, and simply stood there like carved stone with his gray eyes locked on every injury she bore. And when he said her stepfather, it was not a question but a statement. Because of course he knew, Dante Moretti had not become the most powerful crime boss in the city by being unaware of what happened on his streets. And Elena's silence was all the confirmation he required, as darkness flickered through his eyes like lightning before a storm, and then the door burst open, and Dr. Harrison rushed in wearing an embarrassed expression while stumbling over his words as he apologized for the delay and admitted he had not realized Mr. Moretti was here, and as he turned he seemed only then to notice Elena, quickly insisting he would treat Mr. Moretti first and then attend to her. But Dante's voice cut sharply across the room with an authority that could not be mistaken as he ordered the doctor to treat Miss Vasquez first. And even when Dr. Harrison protested that Mr. Moretti's injuries required attention, Dante dismissed it coldly, saying his own wounds could wait, and listing Elena's injuries with exacting clarity: severe bruising on her ribs, a concussion, and a possible laceration on her forehead that might require stitches, and he instructed the doctor to examine her now and ensure she received the best care the hospital could provide, because he did not pay the doctor to stand there staring at him, and Elena felt heat flood her face as she snapped that she did not need him giving orders on her behalf, and that she had taken care of herself for 12 years without his help. But when Dante turned back to her, there was something in his eyes that silenced her. Not anger or disdain, but a deep and festering guilt that had lived there for more than a decade. And in a voice soft as velvet yet heavy as steel, he told her he owned the hospital and knew exactly which room she was in and exactly what condition she was in when she collapsed at the entrance, so she should not tell him he had no right to be here. A muscle feathered in his jaw as he looked away for a fraction of a second, his voice dropping to a growl of pure self-hatred. I was in Sicily. 1 month, the only month in 12 years I took my eyes off this city to handle family business, and look what happens. I returned to find the rats have crawled out of the sewers to touch what is mine. He looked back at her, the guilt in his eyes raw and terrifying. If I had been here yesterday, Ray Donovan would be buried before he ever raised a hand to you. Elena felt as if she had been struck because he owned the hospital and she had worked here for 3 months without knowing, walking these hallways each night, tending to patients, believing she had escaped the shadows of her past while she had actually been working for him the entire time. And her voice trembled with anger as she accused him of watching her all this time, and Dante did not deny it, simply saying he had kept the promise he made to her mother because Isabella had begged him to protect her daughter and he did not break promises to anyone. And Elena wanted to scream and strike his infuriatingly handsome face, but her body ached and her head throbbed, and deep inside she knew she did not have the strength to fight him. Not tonight, not like this. And Dr. Harrison shifted awkwardly between them like a spectator at a tennis match, before finally clearing his throat and saying he would begin examining Miss Vasquez immediately, asking whether Mr. Moretti might prefer to wait outside, but Dante said he would stay and moved to the corner of the room, crossing his arms as he leaned against the wall like a man entirely within his domain, because in truth he was. And when Elena growled at him to leave, insisting she did not need him staring at her like a predator sizing up prey, he answered with maddening calm that he would not leave, not until he knew she was safe, and she could hate him as much as she wanted, and curse his name and wish him to hell. But he would not walk out of that room. Not tonight. Not while she was like this. And Elena looked at him exhausted and furious and helpless to the point she wanted to cry. But she did not cry. She had not cried since the night her mother died, and she would not start now. Not in front of him. Dr. Harrison began the examination with exaggerated care, clearly trying to appease the man standing in the corner of the room, and when he asked Elena to remove the thin paper gown so he could examine her chest, she could feel Dante's gaze burning into her back, even though she refused to turn around, and each time the doctor touched her she bit down on her lip to keep from crying out. And when he announced in a grave tone that she had badly bruised ribs on the left side, a mild concussion, a laceration on her forehead requiring 4 stitches, and bruises in varying shades, some old and some painfully new, he paused with his fingers tracing the dark marks along her arm as he remarked that this was clearly not the first time, and Elena did not answer because she did not need to. Her scars had already spoken for her, 12 years of violence at the hands of Ray Donovan, beginning when she was 13 and lasting until she was 18 and fled, followed by 9 years of running and rebuilding, and now he had found her again. And the doctor stitched her forehead in silence before wrapping her ribs and writing a prescription for painkillers, leaving with a stern reminder to rest for at least 1 week. And only then was Elena forced to face the man who had stood unmoving in the corner through the entire examination, because Dante had not spoken a word while the doctor worked, but she had seen the way his jaw tightened with every new bruise revealed, and the way his hands clenched into fists. When the doctor mentioned older, healed injuries, because he had seen everything, every piece of evidence of the brutality she had endured, and when he finally stepped out of the shadows to ask whether she was ready to tell him the truth, or whether she intended to continue pretending everything was fine, Elena pulled the paper gown back around herself, feeling exposed and painfully vulnerable beneath his unblinking gaze, as she reminded him that he already knew. He had said her stepfather's name. What more could he possibly want? And he told her he wanted to know why she had not called the police, and why she had come here instead of going to a station, and why she had allowed Ray to do this to her over and over again. And she answered with a bitter laugh that the police could do nothing, because Ray had friends in the force, and every time she reported him, he was released within hours, and returned even angrier, and she had learned the hard way that no one would save her. She had only herself to rely on, and when Dante came closer she did not back away because she was too tired to run, and he asked whether she knew who Ray owed money to, and whether she understood why he had suddenly tracked her down after 9 years, and when she shook her head, he told her Ray owed Viktor Kozlov $500,000, and Kozlov was a Russian Mafia boss not known for patience, and Ray had promised payment by offering something of value, or rather someone, and the blood drained from her face as she whispered for him to explain. And Dante told her plainly that her stepfather had sold her to Kozlov and planned to use her to pay his debt, and when she gasped in disbelief he told her this was not the first time because at 18 Ray had arranged a similar deal, preparing to sell her to a human trafficking ring from Eastern Europe. And he reminded her of the night she overheard him discussing the shipment of special merchandise, and why she decided to run away with Sofia that same night. And Elena remembered it all, the icy terror in her veins as she listened to that call, the way she carried Sofia out of bed at 2 a.m. with only a small bag of clothes and a few $100s saved, the 3 months living in a wrecked car and eating from garbage bins while still feeling freer than she had ever been. And Dante told her that the deal never happened. The men who were supposed to take her disappeared, the trafficking ring collapsed, and Ray received a warning that if he touched her or Sofia again, he would lose far more than money. And Elena stared at him as the truth seeped into her mind like poison, whispering that it had been him all along during those 9 years, and Dante confirmed it without a flicker of emotion, saying he had promised her mother and he did not break promises, and Elena needed several seconds to absorb what she had just learned, because he had watched over her from the shadows for 12 years without her knowing, and she should have felt grateful or relieved, but instead anger erupted inside her, fierce and burning and uncontrollable, and she pushed herself off the examination table, ignoring the stabbing pain in her ribs, as she demanded whether he believed he had the right to control her life, and whether he thought her mother's sacrifice gave him permission to decide where she lived or what she did, and he answered with maddening calm that he did not control her life. He simply ensured she remained alive long enough to have one. And Elena laughed bitterly, saying she had protected herself and Sofia for 9 years without anyone's help, especially not the help of a man like him. And when he repeated her words with that quiet flicker in his eyes, she declared plainly that she meant a mafia boss, a killer, and that her mother had died saving him, which had been the greatest mistake of her life because she should have let him die. At least then Elena would still have her mother, and the words hung between them like a blade, while she saw his jaw tighten and his hand clench and release because she had struck the one wound in him that never healed. And when he finally spoke again, breaking the suffocating silence, he told her to come home with him where she would be safe until he dealt with Kozlov. But Elena refused, insisting she would return to her apartment because she had a shift in the morning and needed rest, and Dante said she did not understand. Kozlov knew she mattered to him and would use her to reach him. And Kozlov was not Ray. He would not simply beat her and walk away. He would take her and torture her and send her body to Dante piece by piece to make a point. And Elena answered coldly that he should stay away from her because if she no longer mattered to him, then Kozlov would have no reason to touch her. But Dante told her it was too late because Kozlov already knew he had protected her for years. And in Dante's world, that meant she belonged to him, whether she wanted to or not. And nausea rolled through her because she belonged to no one and had fought her whole life not to be owned by any man. And she would not become the possession of a mafia king simply because her mother had made a fatal mistake 12 years earlier. And she said she was going home in a voice that was final and unyielding, as she retrieved her bag from the corner of the room, despite the pain tearing through her ribs, thanking him for the help he had given without her asking, but telling him to stay out of her life from now on. And when Dante called her name as she reached for the door handle, she stopped but did not turn as he told her that when she realized he was right, and when Kozlov came knocking on her door, she should call the number he was giving her. And she felt him slip a business card into the pocket of her coat, as he said she could call at any hour, day or night, and he would come. But Elena gave no reply as she opened the door and stepped into the hall without looking back, walking through the hospital corridor with the steadiest steps she could manage, while ignoring the curious glances of her colleagues and the agony ripping through her body, telling herself she would go home and lock the door and be fine because she had no other choice. The taxi ride home felt endless, as Elena curled up in the back seat clutching her bag to her chest, while every pothole on the road sent sharp waves of pain through her battered ribs, and she tried not to think about Dante Moretti, or his warnings, or the cold gray eyes that somehow held a flicker of concern, reminding herself she had been right to walk away and forcing herself to believe it. But when the cab stopped in front of her aging apartment building, and she paid the fare and stepped out on unsteady legs, into the eerily silent South Side night, with only the flickering streetlights and the distant cry of a stray cat echoing through the alleyways, she climbed 3 flights of stairs, each step a battle against her battered body. And when she reached her door, every thought in her mind froze because the door had been shattered, the hinges broken and splintered wood scattered across the floor. And Elena stood there with her heart racing wildly as her trembling hand pushed the door open to reveal devastation inside. The sofa overturned with its white stuffing spilling out like exposed organs, the wardrobe toppled with her few clothes strewn across the floor, the dishes in the kitchen shattered into glittering shards beneath the thin light from the hallway. Everything she owned and everything she had spent 9 years rebuilding reduced to wreckage, but what paralyzed her was not the destruction. It was the message on the wall written in large, uneven red letters that looked like blood demanding payment or life, and she staggered back, gripping the doorframe to remain upright, wishing she could believe Ray had done this in drunken vengeance. But he was a violent drunk, not an organized criminal. And this was someone else. This was Kozlov, and her legs carried her into the apartment almost against her will, as she stepped over the ruin toward the small table beside her bed, where she kept the most important things, and her stomach dropped when she saw the drawer forced open. The photos she kept of Sofia scattered across the floor, and beside them new photos she had never seen before. Pictures of Sofia in her wheelchair in the garden of the nursing home, smiling at a nurse. Pictures of her by her window looking out. Pictures of her eating lunch in the common room, all taken from a distance through fences or glass. The work of someone watching, someone stalking, and Elena felt the world collapse beneath her feet, because it was not her they had targeted now. It was Sofia, her innocent 16-year-old sister who could not defend herself, and who was being watched by men even the devil would fear. And Elena fumbled for her phone with hands shaking so violently she almost could not dial, and when a sleepy and impatient voice answered from Sunny Hill's nursing home, she choked out Sofia's name, asking whether she was safe, and begging the woman to check immediately, and after a brief pause, the nurse answered that Sophia was fine, sleeping in her room, and asked if something was wrong. But Elena could not respond and simply stood in the wreckage of her life with tears slipping down her cheeks without her noticing, because Sophia was safe at least for now. But for how long? Because Kozlov had made his message unmistakably clear. He knew where Sophia was, he knew Elena's weakness, and he would not stop until he had what he wanted. And Elena's knees gave out as she collapsed among the broken glass and torn clothing, crying for the first time since the night her mother died 12 years earlier. Not because of physical pain or the destruction of her home, but because she finally understood the brutal truth Dante had tried to tell her. She could not protect Sophia. She could not protect herself, and this time she could not run. And her hand moved instinctively toward the pocket of her coat where Dante's business card remained, heavy as a reminder of her failure. Elena did not know how long she had been sitting there among the broken glass and the stalking photographs of Sophia. Perhaps a few minutes, perhaps hours, because time lost its meaning when fear hollowed out every sense, and she only realized she was no longer alone when footsteps sounded at the door, making her lift her head with her heart pounding wildly, as her hand instinctively searched for something to defend herself with. But the man standing on the threshold was not Kozlov or any of his men, rather a man around 32, tall and lean with neatly cropped brown hair, dressed in a black suit and holding himself like someone intimately familiar with violence, and he surveyed the wrecked apartment, then the tear-streaked woman on the floor, without a flicker of surprise, as he addressed her calmly and professionally as Miss Vasquez, while introducing himself as Marco Santini, sent by Mr. Moretti, and Elena wanted to laugh or scream or both, because of course Dante would send someone. He had watched her for 12 years, so why stop now? And she tried to say she did not need rescuing, but her voice cracked apart, thin and useless, yet Marco said nothing, and simply held out a phone with an active call waiting on the screen, telling her without words that Dante wanted to speak to her. And Elena stared at the phone, as if it were a venomous snake, because she knew that if she picked it up, if she heard Dante's voice, she would have to admit he had been right, that she could not protect herself, that she needed him. But her gaze drifted to the scattered photographs of Sophia, and every scrap of pride inside her dissolved, and she reached for the phone and pressed it to her ear, hearing Dante speak her name in a low, steady voice, as though he had known exactly what would unfold, asking whether she was ready to listen to him. And a sob broke free despite all her efforts to contain it as she whispered that they had pictures of Sophia, that they knew where her sister was, and Dante answered that he already knew, and that he had sent men to the nursing home the moment she left the hospital, assuring her that Sophia was safe and would remain so, but that Elena needed to come to him now. And the tears kept falling, and she hated this weakness and hated needing anyone, especially a Mafia king, but she hated the thought of losing Sophia more. And she told him slowly that if she came, he had to promise her that Sophia would be protected not just now but for as long as this lasted, that no matter what happened to her, her sister had to remain safe. And Dante remarked that she was bargaining with him, a note of amusement slipping into his voice. But she corrected him with steady resolve, saying she was setting conditions because it was the only leverage she had, and Dante's tone shifted into solemn assurance as he promised that Sophia would be protected, that she had his word, that no one, not Kozlov, nor Ray, nor any other soul, would ever touch her, and that she knew all too well how he kept his promises. And Elena closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the moment, understanding this was surrender, that she was letting go of 9 years of running, 9 years of independence, 9 years of convincing herself she needed no one, and she whispered her agreement, the words like ashes on her tongue, and Dante told her Marco would take her and that she should bring nothing because she would have everything she needed, and Elena did not have the strength to argue as she gave the phone back to Marco and allowed him to help her to her feet. And when they stepped out of the ruined apartment, she did not look back because there was nothing worth remembering in that space, only the wreckage of the life she had tried to rebuild. And now she was stepping into another life altogether, one she was not certain she would survive. The black SUV slid through the dark streets of the city, carrying Elena farther and farther from the life she had known, and she sat in silence in the back seat, staring through the window without truly seeing anything, while Marco drove without attempting conversation, a mercy she was quietly grateful for because she had no strength left to speak or even to think. And when the vehicle turned onto a private road lined with towering oak trees, Elena began to understand she was entering an entirely different world. As the massive iron gate opened automatically, and she counted at least 6 guards between Sherazing, the entrance and the main house, and then the Moretti estate rose before her like a modern fortress. 3 stories of Italianate architecture with white stone columns and sweeping balconies bathed in the warm glow of dozens of golden lights. A place both terrifyingly beautiful and overwhelmingly luxurious, large enough that her cramped studio apartment could have fit inside the living room with space to spare. And Marco stopped at the front steps where Dante was waiting, having traded his blood-stained suit for a simple black shirt and slacks, though his presence remained undiminished as he stepped forward to open her door and offered his hand with the effortless elegance of an old-world gentleman. And Elena stared at that hand for a long moment, before reluctantly accepting it as he welcomed her to his home and told her he would show her to her room, and she said nothing as she let him lead her through massive oak doors into a grand foyer with soaring ceilings and glittering crystal chandeliers, marble floors, a sweeping spiral staircase, and oil paintings that looked like antiques lining the walls, every inch radiating wealth and power and a life Elena could never have imagined for herself. And they climbed to the second floor, walking down a long hallway of closed doors until Dante stopped at one and opened it for her, stepping aside so she could enter, and Elena crossed the threshold only to lose her breath, because the room was 3 times the size of her former apartment, with a king-size bed draped in white linens and piles of decorative pillows, a large window overlooking a garden strung with lights, a walnut desk, a velvet armchair, shelves lined with brand-new books, and a private bathroom with a marble tub and rain shower visible through its half-open door. But it was the wardrobe that made her steps falter, the door left open to reveal rows of neatly hung clothing in every style she wore, from work attire to comfortable loungewear, from sleepwear to winter coats, and when she touched a dress with trembling fingers, she realized it was exactly her size, and she checked another and another only to find each one perfect in size, style, and even color preference. And she turned to Dante with her voice barely a whisper, as she asked how long he had been watching her, how long he had known her clothing size, her favorite colors, the books she read. And Dante stood in the doorway without crossing the invisible line into her space, his gray eyes meeting hers without wavering, as he answered 12 years, since the night her mother died in his arms. And Elena felt her knees weaken because for 12 years she had believed she was running, believed she was free, believed she was building a life no one could trace. Yet he had always been there in the shadows, watching and waiting, and she asked why he had never approached her, why he let her struggle for years sleeping in a car, working 3 jobs at once, starving herself to save money for Sofia, and why he had done nothing if he had so much power. And Dante answered that she had never wanted his help, that he had known her long enough to understand she would never take money from a mafia boss, that she wanted independence, and wanted to prove she could survive without anyone. And he respected that and intervened only when her life was truly in danger, and Elena told him he had no right to make that decision for her, and Dante admitted perhaps he did not, tilting his head slightly. But he had promised her mother, and he kept his promises at any cost, and then he turned to leave, pausing halfway down the hall, to tell her the door locked from the inside, and no one would enter without her permission. And she was free to move anywhere in the house, though she should not leave the grounds, and breakfast would be at 7, and they would speak more tomorrow. And then he disappeared into the darkness of the hallway, leaving Elena alone inside her gilded cage. Elena could not sleep that night as she lay on the softest bed she had ever touched, staring up at the high ceiling and feeling as though she were drowning in luxury. And each time she closed her eyes, she saw the stalking photographs of Sofia, the blood-red message on the wall, and the cold gray eyes of Dante, as he admitted he had watched her for 12 years. And when the first light of dawn filtered through the curtains, she abandoned the attempt to sleep and pulled herself out of bed, her body still aching from Ray's beating, though she forced herself to shower and dress, choosing the simplest outfit in the wardrobe, a pair of jeans and a gray sweater, refusing to be seduced by the expensive clothes around her. And at exactly 7 she went down to the dining room as Dante had told her, finding him already seated with a cup of black coffee before him, reading the newspaper, as though this were an ordinary morning rather than the first day. He held a woman in his home against her will, and he looked up at the sound of her steps asking if she had slept well, to which she answered no, and added that he already knew that. And Dante folded the paper and set it aside, giving her his full attention as he said she wanted to discuss the rules, and Elena replied, not really, but she assumed she had no choice, and a ghost of a smile brushed his lips before disappearing as quickly as it came, while he told her she could continue working at the hospital if she wished. But Marco or one of his men would accompany her at all times, and she could not contact Ray or anyone connected to Kozlov, and she could not leave the city without informing him. And most importantly, she could not do anything that put herself in danger. And Elena felt anger rise as she asked whether she was essentially his prisoner, and Dante corrected her calmly, saying she was his guest, a guest he had a responsibility to protect, insisting there was a difference, though she said there was none, and pushed away the plate of food a servant had placed before her, accusing him of controlling every part of her life, where she went, what she did, whom she saw, and that this was the definition of captivity. And Dante tilted his head, studying her with a thoughtful curiosity, as though she were a puzzle he meant to solve before asking if she knew why Sophia's nursing home bills were never as high as they should have been. And Elena froze, because she had wondered about that many times, since Sunny Hills was one of the best facilities in the region, with specialized therapists and care for paralyzed patients, and the fees should have been 2 or 3 times what she was paying, though she had assumed it was insurance or some assistance program, and she whispered that he would not dare, even as she already knew the answer. And Dante said 3 years, confirming her fear, explaining that since she had moved Sophia there he had paid the difference, asking her why she thought her sister had the nicest private room, why she had a dedicated nurse, 24/7, why she received physical therapy 3 times a week instead of once, and Elena felt as though she had been slapped because for 3 years she had worked herself to exhaustion, skipped meals, denied herself basic comforts to save money for Sophia, and all the while Dante had quietly covered most of the cost without her knowing, and she should have felt grateful, but instead she felt betrayed as she asked why he had done it and why he could not simply leave her alone, and Dante answered, because he had promised her mother and because Sophia deserved the best care and was innocent in all of this. And Elena rose abruptly, her chair scraping against the marble floor as she faced him with all the fury and helplessness inside her, telling him she was not a bird to be kept in a golden cage, or a pet to be fed and watched, that she was a human being, and no matter how much he paid or how fiercely he protected her, he did not own her. And Dante stood as well, seeming taller and more imposing than she remembered. Yet when he spoke, his voice was unexpectedly gentle as he told her. He knew she was not a bird. She was a wolf, a wounded wolf, fighting to protect her pack. And he did not wish to cage her. He only wanted to keep her safe until she was strong enough to fight on her own. And then he turned toward the doorway, pausing only long enough to tell her to eat, because she needed her strength before disappearing and leaving Elena alone, with a storm of emotions she had no idea how to tame. A week passed as slowly as honey dripping to the bottom of a jar, and Elena gradually adjusted to the rhythms of life inside the Moretti estate, though she would never admit it aloud, waking each morning in the most luxurious room she had ever touched, and returning each night to a bed softer than anything she had known, continuing her night shifts at street, Catherine's, but now always trailed by Marco or one of Dante's men who followed her like silent shadows, prompting her colleagues to whisper and cast curious glances at the man in the black suit, waiting in the hallway, glances Elena never explained because she had no idea how to. And the thing that surprised her most was breakfast, because every morning at exactly 7, she entered the dining room to find Dante already seated, a cup of black coffee before him, reading the newspaper as if this were any ordinary morning. Rather than the first days of keeping a woman essentially confined beneath his roof, and he never forced conversation, sometimes they sat through the entire meal in silence, broken only by the sound of utensils and the rustle of turning pages. But slowly that silence became less tense, almost comfortable, and Elena found herself anticipating those breakfasts, a realization that frightened her more than any threat Kozlov could make, and she began observing Dante in ways she never had before, not as a fearsome mafia boss, but as a man, noticing how he addressed each servant by name, remembered their birthdays, asked after their families, noticing how Rosa, the elderly cook who had served the Moretti family for 3 decades, told Elena that Dante had paid for her husband's cancer surgery and never asked for repayment, merely saying it was the right thing to do, leaving Elena unsure what to make of him. And one night when she could not sleep and wandered downstairs for water, she found the library light still on, and paused at the doorway to see Dante seated in an armchair beside the fireplace with a thick book in hand. His face relaxed in a way she had never seen, the usual tension erased to reveal someone younger and wearier. And when she asked what he was reading without knowing why she stepped into the room instead of turning away, he lifted the book to show her the cover and answered Marcus Aurelius, Meditations, a book she knew well from the nights she had spent living in a car with Sophia, searching for steadiness in Stoic philosophy, and she had never imagined a Mafia patriarch reading such a thing. So she asked whether he liked philosophy, and he replied that he liked things that helped him understand himself because in his line of work, losing control of one's mind meant losing one's life. And Elena walked deeper into the library, letting her fingers brush the spines of books that had clearly been read, their bindings worn and their margins filled with pencil notes, volumes by Plato, Aristotle, Nietzsche, Camus, A collection that was not for show? And she murmured that he was not what she had imagined, making him ask what she had imagined, and she replied that she had seen him as a monster, with nothing in him but violence and cold blood, and she watched a flicker of pain cross his eyes before he masked it as he answered that he was a monster, that he had killed and would kill again, and he did not apologize for that nor pretend to be good. But that did not mean he could not read books or care about the people who worked for him or keep a promise made to a dying woman, and Elena found herself without words as the version of Dante she had held in her mind began to fracture, leaving her uncertain whether she wanted to rebuild a different version, because it had been easier to hate him, easier to see him as an enemy, as her captor, far harder when he became a man who read philosophy at midnight and remembered his servants' birthdays, and Dante told her she should sleep because she had an early shift, and she nodded and turned away but stopped at the doorway to offer a quiet good night, calling him Mr. Moretti, and he gently corrected her, saying Dante, that when it was just the two of them, she could call him Dante, and Elena did not respond as she walked away, her heartbeat unsteady for reasons she refused to acknowledge. The nightmare came on the 10th night, just when Elena had begun to think she might finally be safe, and in it she stood once more on the blood-soaked sidewalk outside the old apartment building, 15 years old, small and helpless, watching her mother lying on the ground with warm brown eyes turning empty as red seeped through the floral blouse she loved most, and Elena reached for her, but her mother drifted farther and farther away, as though sinking into a bottomless dark. And then the scene shifted, and Elena was no longer 15, but back in the shabby apartment of her youth with Ray standing before her, a leather belt in his hand and the stench of alcohol heavy on his breath as he snarled that she thought she could escape him before the belt cracked down through the air. And Elena screamed and screamed, but no one came. No one ever came. And she curled in on herself, waiting for the pain. But instead someone shook her shoulder, a voice breaking through the fog of terror, calling her name, telling her to wake up, that it was only a dream. And she opened her eyes, gasping for air, with her heart pounding so violently, it felt as though it might tear through her chest. And in the dimness of the room, Dante's face came into view, his gray eyes filled with worry, his hand still resting on her shoulder, dressed in a black t-shirt and sleep pants, with his hair slightly tousled as though he had leapt from bed the moment he heard her, and he asked if she was all right in a voice so gentle Elena almost believed she was still dreaming, but she could not answer because her body was shaking uncontrollably, and her breath came in short, desperate bursts. And then without warning the tears came, not the silent tears she had trained herself to shed through years of abuse, but a raw, guttural sob from deep within her chest, carrying 12 years of buried pain and fear. And Dante said nothing as he sat beside her on the bed and gathered her into his arms. And Elena knew she should push him away, knew she should keep the walls she had spent so many years building, but she no longer had the strength because she was tired, tired of being strong, tired of fighting, tired of being alone. And so for the first time in 12 years, Elena Vasquez let someone witness her brokenness as she pressed her face into Dante's chest and cried, crying for her mother who died, for the childhood stolen from her, for the sister who would never walk again, for every night spent curled inside a broken-down car, cold and hungry and terrified while wondering if tomorrow would be any better. And Dante held her tighter with one arm wrapped around her back and the other stroking her hair gently, offering no empty reassurances, only his steady warmth and a presence as solid as stone in a storm, whispering against her hair that he would never let anyone hurt her again. Not anyone. Not ever. And she did not know how long they stayed like that, minutes or hours. But slowly her sobs softened, and her breathing steadied, and the trembling eased until she remained resting in his arms, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat and feeling the heat of his body. And for the first time in her memory, Elena felt safe. Not the fragile illusion of safety she used to force upon herself, but a real safety born of knowing someone would stand between her and the darkness. A realization that frightened her more than any nightmare ever could. After that night of nightmares, everything shifted in ways Elena could not define. And although she and Dante never spoke of what had happened, or of the hours she had spent crying in his arms, something unspoken lingered between them, a fragile, invisible thread woven from vulnerability and silence, a connection she did not know how to hold or how to sever, and she began allowing herself to think of Dante differently, to think of him as a man rather than only a Mafia patriarch. But on the 14th night, whatever illusions she had begun to build shattered entirely when she found herself unable to sleep, partly because of her late shift, and partly because thoughts of Dante spiraled endlessly in her mind, and she went downstairs for water moving through the familiar darkened halls, But instead of turning right toward the kitchen, she heard strange sounds drifting from the basement, muffled voices, strained breaths, and Dante's voice colder and more distant than she had ever heard. And she knew she should not go down there, because every instinct she possessed screamed at her to turn back, not to look, not to know, yet her feet carried her forward toward the stairs, and the steel door left slightly ajar with a thin line of yellow light spilling through, and standing in the shadows, she looked through the gap and watched the world she was trying to rebuild collapse, seeing Dante in the middle of a bare concrete room with his sleeves rolled to his elbows and blood smeared along his forearms. And before him a man was tied to a chair, his face swollen beyond recognition, blood dripping from his nose and mouth forming a dark pool at his feet, while Marco stood silently in the corner, expression carved from stone, and Dante spoke with a voice she did not recognize as the same man who had held her as she cried, a voice devoid of warmth or mercy as he asked for the last time what information had been sold to Kozlov. And when the man tried to answer, Dante cut him off, picking up a small knife from the table and driving it through the traitor's bound hand without hesitation, the scream ripping through the basement as Elena covered her mouth to keep from crying out. Frozen in place, though she wanted to run, unable to look away as Dante slowly withdrew the blade with clinical precision and set it on the table, tilting his head with a cold, curious detachment as though studying an insect, telling the man he still had 9 fingers and then 10 toes and then other body parts and that he had the entire night while the traitor did not. And Elena did not hear the response, because she had already turned and fled, running up the stairs, running through the hallway, running into her bathroom, where she collapsed before the toilet and retched until there was nothing left, until her body trembled and her limbs felt hollow. Because this was the true face of Dante Moretti, not the man who read philosophy in the library, not the man who had held her through her nightmares, but a creature born of violence, a cold-blooded killer capable of torture without the slightest flicker of remorse. And Elena sat on the cold tile floor hugging her knees as she tried to stop shaking, thinking of her mother who had died saving a man like that, thinking of herself, of how she had begun to feel safe in the arms of a monster, thinking of Dante's rare smile, and the way he looked at her as though she were the most precious thing in the world, and she wondered whether she could keep living here now that she knew the truth he had never bothered to hide. Elena did not know how long she sat on the bathroom floor, minutes or hours, only that when a knock sounded at the door her body had gone numb, and her trembling had faded into a strange hollow stillness, and she knew who stood on the other side even before his voice came through the wood, calling her name and telling her he knew she had seen, but she did not answer because she was not sure she could form words, and after a long silence she heard the door to her room open, and heavy footsteps cross the floor. Though he did not try to force the bathroom door, nor even approach it, simply stood there separated from her by a thin wooden barrier, as he said he would not apologize because the man downstairs had sold information about her to Kozlov, and was the reason her apartment had been destroyed, and the reason Sofia had been watched. And Elena closed her eyes as the images she had witnessed rose again, the blood, the screaming, the knife driving through flesh, and Dante's face carved from ice, and his voice continued saying he never pretended to be good, and had told her from the beginning what he was, a monster, a killer, that this was his true nature and this was how he protected what belonged to him. And Elena whispered that she did not belong to him, making Dante exhale heavily before admitting perhaps not, but she was under his protection and anyone who threatened her would pay, and he would never apologize for keeping her safe. And silence settled between them thick and suffocating, as Elena wanted to shout that she did not need this kind of protection, nor anyone torturing and killing on her behalf, yet the words died in her throat, and Dante spoke again as if hearing her thoughts, telling her she would not leave, not now while Kozlov hunted her, but if after everything she still wanted to go he would let her, that he would not force her to stay with a monster. And then his footsteps receded, and the door to her room closed softly, leaving her alone in the darkness with her thoughts. And she did not sleep that night, but lay on her bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Dante, about what she had seen, about what she felt, remembering the years Ray beat her with pointless drunken cruelty, simply because he could, and because she was weaker. Violence she had known and recognized, the violence of a coward striking someone defenseless, and yet what she had seen in the basement was different, because Dante had not tortured that man out of pleasure or rage, but with a clear purpose, to extract information, to protect his territory, to protect her. And did that make it right? Elena did not know. She was not a philosopher nor a judge, only a girl who had spent her life running and had seen too much violence to believe in a world divided neatly into good and evil. And when she was honest with herself, she realized something that frightened her more than the torture she had witnessed. She was not afraid of Dante, though she should have been, because she had just watched him drive a knife through a man's hand without blinking and knew he was capable of far worse. Yet when she thought of Dante, she did not feel fear. She saw the man who held her while she cried, the gray eyes filled with real worry when she woke from nightmares. The protector who had watched over her and Sophia for 12 years without asking for anything in return. And maybe she was broken. Maybe the years of abuse had twisted her moral compass beyond repair. Or maybe living her whole life in darkness had taught her there were no purely good or purely evil people, only those willing to do whatever it took to protect what they loved. And Dante Moretti, monster or not, had chosen to protect her. And by the time dawn seeped through the curtains, Elena had her answer. She was not running, not because she could not, but because she did not want to. The next 2 weeks unfolded in a strange dance of closeness and distance, and after the night Elena witnessed Dante's brutality and still chose to stay, something between them shifted in ways subtle yet undeniable, because neither of them spoke of it, but both knew a boundary had been crossed. And on the second day after that night, Dante offered to teach her self-defense, and Elena agreed without hesitation because she needed to feel control again, needed to know that if danger ever came for her and she stood alone, she would still be able to fight. And the basement gym of the estate was equipped like a professional training center with mats and sandbags and all sorts of equipment she did not know the names of. And during the first session, Dante taught her the basics, the stance, the balance, the way to curl her hand to punch without breaking a finger, patient and methodical and keeping a respectful distance, touching her only to adjust her posture. But by the third session, something began to change when he taught her how to escape being held from behind, and he stepped in close with his arms around her, and suddenly the air in the gym grew thick and heavy until she could barely breathe, because she felt the heat of his chest against her back, smelled the mix of sandalwood and something darker, more masculine, felt his breath at her hair, and her body reacted in ways her rational mind could not control, and his voice came lower and rougher than usual, as he told her to drive her elbow into his ribs, then stomp his foot and turn away. And she followed the motions, but when she turned she found herself face to face with him, only inches apart, staring into gray eyes darkened by something she did not dare name, and they stood there breathing hard. And Elena could not tell whether it was from the exercise or from something else entirely, until Dante stepped back, breaking the moment, and praised her with a steady voice as though nothing had happened, telling her to continue. And that same script repeated itself again and again throughout the 2 weeks, each session thickening the tension between them until it felt electric and unmistakable, with moments when his hand pressed at her hip to guide her stance, and she felt his fingers tighten more than necessary, and moments when he pinned her to the mat in a grappling move, and she looked up to find his eyes blackened with restrained desire, and moments when she was certain he would kiss her, when she wanted him to kiss her, but he always stepped away, always reset the distance, always reasserted control, until one night after a session so charged Elena thought she might combust, she finally broke, standing in the middle of the gym, drenched in sweat, and breathless as she asked why he always stopped, insisting she was no longer a 15-year-old girl and could make her own choices. And Dante stood a few steps away with his back to the punching bag, and she saw the familiar tightening of his jaw as he told her she did not understand, pushing her to demand he explain. And she stepped closer, watching him go rigid as though she were more dangerous to him than any enemy he had ever faced. And he whispered that he had made a promise to her mother, not only to protect her but to keep a second vow Elena had never known, and she stood there with her heart pounding as she asked what else her mother had made him promise, and he answered that her mother had told him never to touch her, never to love her, insisting she deserved a normal life with a normal man, not a monster like him, forcing him to swear he would keep his distance. And Elena felt her world come to a halt as she realized her mother, the woman who had died saving Dante, had used her final breath to ensure he would never love her daughter. And Dante, who treated promises like sacred vows, had spent 12 years fighting himself because of it, and he went on to say he stopped because if he touched her, if he truly touched her, he would never be able to stop, and he would break the promise he made to the dying woman who saved his life. And then he turned and walked away, leaving Elena standing alone in the gym, with the truth still echoing in the air and crushing her heart. 3 days had passed since the night Dante revealed the promise he had made to her mother, and Elena still had no idea how to carry the weight of that truth. And she and Dante moved around each other carefully, their breakfasts turning quiet and awkward, their self-defense lessons suspended indefinitely, as she spent most of her time either in her room or at the hospital trying not to think about the gray eyes filled with anguish when he confessed he had been fighting himself for 12 long years, until everything collapsed on an otherwise ordinary afternoon, when she sat in the library pretending to read a book, though her eyes had dragged across the same page for half an hour, and her phone vibrated with a message from an unknown number, containing a video. And when she opened it, the world simply stopped because it was Sophia, her little sister, sitting in her familiar wheelchair, but not in the bright room of the nursing home, instead trapped in a dim concrete space with her hands tied to the chair and her face pale with fear, her eyes swollen from crying, a fresh bruise blooming on her cheek, and Sophia's trembling voice saying, "Sister Elena, I am sorry. They said you have to come or they will," before the camera shifted to reveal an unfamiliar face, a middle-aged man with silver-streaked blonde hair, ice-blue eyes, and the predatory smile of someone who delighted in cruelty, and he spoke in a thick Russian accent, introducing himself as Viktor Kozlov and telling her they needed to talk, that she had 24 hours to go to the address he would send, and that she must come alone, without Moretti or anyone else, or he would send her sister back to her piece by piece, beginning with those delicate little fingers, and when the video ended, Elena could not breathe. Rising to her feet so quickly, the book crashed to the floor as she ran down the hall and down the stairs toward the front door, because she had to go, and she had to save Sophia, and she would trade her life for her sister's without hesitation, only to be stopped by Dante's voice, booming like thunder, before his arm slashed across her path and pulled her back as she screamed at him to let her go, pounding her fists against his chest, though he did not move an inch, crying out that Sophia had been taken and she had to go. And he answered with a calmness that infuriated her that he already knew, that the message had reached him as well. And when she stared at him with wet, furious eyes, demanding how he could stop her if he understood, insisting it was her sister, her baby, and that they would kill her if she did not go, he tightened his grip on her shoulders and told her that if she went they would kill them both, because Kozlov did not want negotiation, he wanted leverage against him, he wanted war, and Sophia was the bait. And Elena sobbed that she did not care about war or territory or anything else, that she only wanted her sister safe, and if she had to die for that to happen, then she would. And Dante pulled her against him, holding her so tightly she could not struggle, whispering into her hair with a tremor she had never heard in his voice that she did not need to die, that he would save Sophia and bring her home, but she had to trust him and she had to stay. Asking how she could possibly trust him or sit safely in this house while her sister was being tortured somewhere in the dark. And he answered that he had promised her mother he would protect both her and Sophia, that he kept his promises no matter the cost, that Kozlov would pay dearly for what he had done because he had touched something that belonged to him, and that would be the last mistake he ever made. And Elena could no longer form words, standing there shaking and weeping into Dante's chest while praying to anyone listening that her sister would survive the night. The Moretti estate transformed into a war fortress within an hour, and Elena stood in the corner of the vast living room with eyes swollen from crying as dozens of men in black suits gathered, checking weapons and receiving orders from Marco, while Dante stood among them like a commander on the eve of his final battle, his voice deep and authoritative as he assigned positions, and she had never seen him like this. Not the man who read philosophy in the library, not the man who held her while she cried, but the Dante Moretti the underworld feared, the head of the Moretti family, the one they called the Reaper, and he was about to walk into the enemy's den to rescue her sister. And when the men began to move out, Dante turned toward her, murmured something to Marco, then strode across the room with long, determined steps, and Elena straightened as he approached, trying to keep her trembling under control, telling him that he would bring Sophia back, as if making a statement rather than asking, and he answered that he would, stopping close enough for her to see the flecks of gold in his gray eyes and feel the heat of his body, adding that he would end Kozlov and the man would never again threaten her or Sophia. And Elena nodded, swallowing the fear knotting her throat, wanting to tell him to be careful, that he too must come back alive. But the words caught and she could only look at him with all the emotion she did not know how to name. And Dante lifted a hand to her face and touched her cheek with his fingertips, something breaking in his eyes as he whispered 12 years. 12 years of keeping his distance. 12 years of fighting himself every single day. And that if tonight was his last night he would not die without. But he did not finish, because instead he pulled her to him and kissed her, not a gentle kiss nor a hesitant one, but the kiss of a man who had waited far too long, wanted far too much, and no longer had the strength to restrain himself, his mouth claiming hers with a fierce, almost desperate hunger, one hand sliding into her hair, while the other gripped her waist as though afraid she might disappear, and Elena responded without a moment's hesitation, hooking her arms around his neck and pulling him closer, pouring all her fear and longing and the nameless storm she had tried to bury into that kiss, tasting the desperation of a man stepping into death's shadow, unsure if he would return. And when they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, Dante resting his forehead against hers with his gray eyes closed, as he whispered that he had broken the promise he made to her mother, his voice thick with guilt and something else, something that sounded like release. And Elena lifted her hand to his cheek and forced him to look at her as she told him that her mother wanted her to be happy and she would understand. And Dante looked at her for a long moment, as if committing her face to memory, then kissed her again, shorter but no less intense, telling her to wait for him before turning and walking away without looking back. And Elena stood there with her lips still burning from his kiss, watching until the door closed behind him, knowing that this would be the longest night of her life. The abandoned warehouse on the eastern docks was Kozlov's den, the place he believed no one would dare touch, and he was wrong, because Dante and 20 of his men entered at 2 a.m, silent as ghosts and deadly as the Reaper's blade, the outer guards falling before they could make a sound, their throats opened cleanly by Marco and the advance team. And Dante did not bother lifting a hand for such small prey as he saved his strength for the man he had come for. And when the steel door of the warehouse blew open under the force of explosives, hell poured out, gunfire roaring through the enclosed space, screams erupting, curses shouted in Russian, bodies thudding onto concrete as Dante moved through the chaos like a storm, the gun in his hand spitting fire with deadly precision, 1 bullet to the head, 1 to the chest, wasting no ammunition, no time, no mercy, because mercy had no place here, and Sofia was somewhere inside this building and he would burn the world to the ground if that was what it took to bring her out alive. And the first floor was cleared in 5 minutes, with 6 of Kozlov's men lying motionless in their own spreading pools of blood under the flickering neon lights, and Dante did not spare them a second glance, as he signaled Marco to take a team to the basement, while he and the remaining men moved upward, the metal stairs rattling under their weight, and when Dante reached the second-floor hall he heard crying. The soft, desperate crying of a young girl, and he kicked open the nearest door to find Sofia still bound to her wheelchair, her face wet with tears and terror, 2 guards turning their guns toward him as the door swung open. But Dante was faster, firing twice in quick succession, and dropping them where they stood, one with a bullet to the head and the other to the throat, then stepping past their bodies, as if stepping past refuse, crossing the room with a gentleness so at odds with the carnage behind him as he cut the ropes and told her she was safe, that he was Dante Moretti and her sister had sent him to bring her home. And Sofia looked at him with the same brown eyes as Elena, trembling yet flickering with hope as she asked if her sister was all right, and he told her she was waiting at home before ordering one of his men to take her to the car and protect her with his life. And once she was safely escorted out, Dante pressed deeper into the warehouse, knowing Kozlov was still hiding somewhere, because rats never flee their holes when war erupts, and Viktor Kozlov was far too arrogant to run, and he found him in the 3rd-floor office, trying to escape through a back door with a suitcase of cash, greeting him with a cold question about where he thought he was going, and Kozlov turned with fear, widening his eyes at the sight of Dante standing there with blood on his shirt and a smoking gun in his hand, stammering that they could negotiate now that the girl had been returned, that there was no reason for further violence. But Dante cut him off, telling him he had touched what belonged to him, that he had kidnapped an innocent child, beaten her, terrified her, and that there was no negotiation for such things. And when Kozlov reached for the gun hidden behind him, Dante shot him in the hand and then the knee, dropping him to the floor screaming, standing over him with eyes devoid of mercy, and telling him that if he wanted war, he had it. Before placing the final bullet through his forehead and ending the Russian kingpin's life in an instant, and Dante lingered only a moment before turning away because there was one more task left, and he found Ray Donovan chained in the basement like the dog he was, the man who had sold Elena's location to Kozlov to settle his debts, the man Kozlov had kept as a prize to offer Elena if she came. And Dante pulled out his phone and called her, telling her that Sofia was safe and on her way home, listening as Elena's sobs of relief spilled through the speaker until his chest tightened, then telling her there was one more thing, that her stepfather was here, and asking what she wanted him to do with the man, and silence stretched across the line before Elena spoke with an icy calm he had never heard from her, telling him she wanted Ray to never find them again. And Dante looked at Ray and smiled, the smile of death itself, promising her she had his word. And that night Ray Donovan disappeared from the earth, no body ever recovered, no questions ever asked, as if he had never existed at all. And for Elena Vasquez, that was exactly what she wanted. Sofia arrived at the Moretti estate at 4 a.m, and Elena ran to her with tears streaming as she pulled her sister into her arms, feeling the small, trembling body pressed against her, and whispering apologies and love she had held back for far too long. And Sofia cried into her shoulder, but it was the sound of relief, not terror, and Dante's private physician came to examine her and confirmed she had only minor bruising with no serious injuries, and Elena guided her into the room, prepared beside her own, equipped with every form of support a disabled child might need, and with a nurse stationed there around the clock. And when Sofia finally fell asleep, exhausted by the nightmare she had endured, Elena allowed herself to think of Dante, who had not returned, and when she found Marco, he told her Dante was back but had locked himself in the library, refusing medical attention, and her heart tightened at the thought of the blood on his shirt when he left, the way he had walked out like a man uncertain he would return. So she pushed open the library door and saw him sitting in his familiar armchair beside the dim fireplace, with a half-empty bottle of whiskey at his elbow, staring at nothing with hollow eyes, his shirt soaked in blood, some of it his enemy's, but she saw the tear at his left shoulder, where fresh blood still seeped through the cloth, and she told him he was hurt, her voice more statement than question as she stepped inside and shut the door. And Dante lifted his gaze, showing exhaustion not of the body but of the soul, telling her it was only a scratch and that she should sleep because Sofia needed her, but Elena told him Sofia was already sleeping and that he needed his wound tended, and she went to the cabinet she had discovered during her first week, gathering gauze and antiseptic, before returning to him with a steadiness born of years caring for herself, telling him to take off his shirt, and he held her gaze a long moment, as though weighing whether to resist, before finally exhaling and removing the blood-stained fabric, revealing a body mapped with muscle and scars, and Elena knelt beside him cleaning the wound, a through-and-through bullet graze, not deep but still requiring care, her hands practiced and precise even as her heart raced, feeling the heat of his skin under her fingers, smelling gunpowder and blood and that scent that was his alone, when he asked in a low, trembling voice why she was doing this, why after everything she had seen him do she would still remain, and she answered simply that he had saved her sister, that he had kept his promise, and he told her he had broken another promise, the most important one, and the pain in his voice stilled her hands as she lifted her eyes to meet the storm inside his, and she reminded him that he had already told her about the vow never to love her, and he whispered that her mother had said those words directly to him, his hand rising as if to touch her but falling again, and he recounted how on the night she lay dying in his arms, she said her daughter deserved a normal life, a small home in the suburbs, a husband with an ordinary job, children who would grow up never knowing violence, and that she made him swear to protect Elena from afar, never to come close, never to pull her into his world. Tears burning in Elena's eyes as he continued, saying her mother told him that if he truly wanted to repay her, he would let her daughter live the life she never had, a life without darkness, without monsters, without him, and he had sworn it and kept that vow for 12 years. But the night he saw her in the hospital beaten and broken, he knew he could no longer stay away, knew he would shatter every promise if that was what it took to keep her safe, and he placed his hand on her cheek, wiping away her tears as he whispered that he had kissed her, that in doing so he had broken the last vow made to the woman who died for him, because he loved her. Elena had loved her for far longer than he would admit, telling himself it was duty or guilt or oath, but it had always been love, even when he tried to deny it. And Elena looked at him, this man who had carried the weight of her mother's dying request for 12 long years, who had fought himself every day, who had kept his distance even when it destroyed him inside, and she realized she no longer wanted him to bear that burden alone. Elena placed her hand against Dante's chest and felt the rapid thrum of his heartbeat beneath her palm as she told him her mother had been wrong, her voice trembling yet certain, and he went still beneath her touch with gray eyes widening in surprise as she continued before fear could silence her, saying that her mother had loved her and wanted the best for her, but could not have known who she would grow into or where life would take her, believing happiness meant a small house and an ordinary husband, but that this too had been a mistake, because for 12 years Elena had been running from Ray and from memories and from anyone who tried to come close, building walls and convincing herself that loneliness was freedom, when in truth she had never been free, only alone and exhausted and frightened every single day. Until he appeared, she whispered through her tears, he with all his violence and darkness and everything her mother tried to keep her from, yet also the first person who ever made her feel safe, the first to hold her while she cried without demanding anything in return, the first to look at all her scars without turning away. And when Dante breathed her name like a prayer, she told him she no longer wanted to run, that she did not want the ordinary life her mother dreamed of, that she wanted this, wanted him, with all the danger and madness wrapped inside it, that she wanted to wake knowing he was there, wanted him to hold her through the nightmares, wanted, But she did not finish because he pulled her into his arms and kissed her as though she were air and he were drowning, a kiss different from the desperate one before the battle, this one carrying not farewell but the fragile promise of a beginning, his mouth moving over hers with a tenderness she never expected from a man capable of killing, and she melted into him, surrendering entirely as he rose and lifted her without breaking the kiss, her legs circling his waist, her fingers tangled in his hair, and she did not ask where he was taking her because she did not need to ask. She trusted him with everything she had, and in his darker, the larger room she noticed nothing but him as he laid her on the bed with a care so aching it nearly broke her, and he paused above her with gray eyes gone black with wanting, as he told her that if they crossed this line there would be no return, that she would belong to him completely and he would never let her go. And she answered that she did not want to be let go, that she wanted to belong to him and wanted him to belong to her. And that night in the moonlit shadows they found each other in the way both had longed for, Dante touching her as though she were the most precious thing he had ever held, his lips moving over each old scar like an apology for every pain she had suffered, while Elena let herself be carried into the heat and breath and whispered ruin of it all until the last of her walls fell away. And afterward, as they lay together with their bodies entwined, and their breathing slowly settling, Dante lifted her chin and looked into her eyes and told her he loved her, the words carrying the weight of 12 years of waiting, saying he had loved her perhaps since the moment he saw her kneeling beside her dying mother, fierce even as her world collapsed, and that he would love her until the day he died and beyond, seeking her again in whatever life came after. And Elena whispered that she loved him too, the words she had feared for so long now flowing as easily as breath, calling him her monster, her protector, her home. And Dante kissed her once more, gently and with all the love he had held back for years, and Elena knew that whatever came next, she would never be alone again, for she had found where she belonged, in the arms of the man her mother died to save, in the gilded cage that had become a sanctuary, in the dark and perfect love she had never dared to imagine. The first light of dawn slipped through the curtains and woke Elena from the deepest sleep she had known in years, and she felt the warmth of Dante's body beside her, with his arm still wrapped around her waist as though even in sleep he could not bear to let her go. So she lay there for a moment listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat and soaking in a peace she never believed she would be allowed to feel again. When she shifted, Dante woke instantly, the reflex of a man who had lived his entire life inside danger, but when his eyes found hers, the gray in them softened, and a rare smile curved his mouth as he whispered "Good morning" in that sleep rough. The gentle voice she now knew was reserved only for her, and Elena realized it was the first time in 12 years she had opened her eyes without dread waiting for her. Dante sat up and reached for the nightstand drawer, pulling out a small velvet box, and her heart quickened as he opened it, only to falter at the sight of a key instead of the ring she briefly imagined, an old-world platinum master key carved with intricate patterns, looking more like art than something meant to be used. "This is the master key," he said quietly, his tone serious yet tender. "It opens every door in my life, this house, the other properties, the bank accounts, everything, and I want you to have it." Elena stared at the key, then at him, confused until he placed it into her hand and closed her fingers around it, telling her he wanted her to stay because she chose to, not because she had nowhere else to go, that she had been trapped too many times already, and he refused to be another cage. Tears filled her eyes when she understood what he was giving her, for Dante, a man of control and possessiveness, was offering her absolute freedom, even if it meant breaking himself to let her walk away. She looked at the key, felt its weight, felt the weight of trust and love it carried, then set it gently on the table and turned back to him saying she chose to stay. She chose him, not out of desperation but because this was where she wanted to be. The way he looked at her then made her feel as though she had handed him the entire world, and perhaps she had. 3 months later, Elena's life had transformed so completely, she sometimes struggled to believe it was her own. She still worked as a nurse at Street Catherine's, not because she needed the money but because she loved the work and the quiet fulfillment of helping people. While Sophia lived with them in the mansion, healing under the best physical therapy program money could buy, her smile growing brighter each day as she blossomed in the safety she had never known before. Dante remained, Dante still dangerous and ruthless in the underworld, still the Reaper whispered about in fear, yet with Elena and Sophia he was a different man entirely, teaching Sophia to play chess, reading to her when she could not sleep, watching the two sisters with a tenderness Elena knew he had buried inside himself for years. One evening, as they sat in the back garden watching the sun dip behind the distant hills, Dante sank to one knee before her, and her heart pounded as he opened a small box to reveal a simple platinum ring set with a single rare amber diamond. The color, he said, had always reminded him of her mother's warm eyes. "You gave me something I never believed I deserved," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "A family, a home, a reason to want to wake up every morning." And he asked her if she would allow him the rest of his life to repay her. Elena lifted the ring and saw the single word engraved inside. Home. And with tears slipping down her cheeks she whispered, "Yes, 1,000,000 times yes." As Dante slid the ring onto her finger and kissed her beneath the fading gold of the sunset, Elena thought of her mother, the woman who had given her life to save a stranger, who used her final breath to shield her daughter from darkness. She had been wrong about Dante, but she had been right about one thing. Elena deserved happiness, and for the first time Elena truly felt it. She watched Sofia laughing in her wheelchair beside Rosa in the garden, then turned to the man her mother had died to save, the man who had kept his promise for 12 long years, the man who had loved her from the shadows and finally stepped into the light. She thought of her journey from the 15-year-old girl kneeling beside her mother's body, to the young woman sleeping in her car with her sister, to the exhausted nurse working night shifts, to the woman loved by the most feared man in the city, and she realized that life had never gone the way she planned. Yet perhaps that was its strange and beautiful truth, the gilded cage becoming a throne and the monster becoming her home. The story of Elena and Dante may not be the fairy tale many expect, but it carries truths worth holding close, reminding us first that people are never simply good or evil, that Dante may be a mafia lord and a killer, yet he is also a man of promises and fierce protection. Second, that resilience is a quiet, powerful force, seen in Elena, who endured what few could imagine yet never stopped fighting for herself and her sister. And third, that home is not a place but a feeling, the sense of safety and love found beside the people who anchor our hearts. Thank you for listening this far, and if this story touched you, please take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the stories we release each day. A like and share from you helps this tale reach more hearts and spread its human truths. I would love to know how this story made you feel, whether a moment stirred your emotions or a character reminded you of someone in your own life, whether a lesson lingers with you. Please share your thoughts in the comments. I read every one and treasure them deeply. Finally, I wish each of you watching this good health, joy, and love in your days ahead, and may you remember that no matter how hard life becomes, there is always light at the end of the tunnel, and sometimes home is found in the places we least expect. Goodbye for now, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.